Welcome. Before we get started in earnest, I have a challenge for everyone. Who can name the person on the left in this slide? It's a chance to use your ask a question button that you should see below. Not seeing any answers. It's okay. I had to look it up too. That is Harvey Washington Wiley. He's the first commissioner of the FDA who served from 1907 to 1912. And in case you think commissioners moving from the FDA to industry is a recent phenomenon, as highlighted by Scott Gottlieb joining Pfizer's board of directors, Wiley left the FDA to join Good Housekeeping magazine, and the Good Housekeeping seal of approval that he helped create was seen by some as a bit of a rival to the FDA's own imprimatur. So welcome. Thank you for joining us. This webinar is being recorded, and the slides will be sent around, so feel free to quiz your friends when you get the slide deck. I'm Nielsen Hobbs, and for those of you who dialed in by mistake, Scott Gottlieb is the guy on the thumbnail on the right, and he was the most recent commissioner of the US Food and Drug Administration. I hope that everyone can see the slides. If you can't, please press the test your connection button or send us a message again through the ask a question button, and we'll get that figured out for you. The topic of this address is, of course, looking back and looking ahead. So those buildings in the big triangle are an artist's rendering of the master plan for the FDA's campus in White Oak, and I thought that was a nice way of kind of looking ahead. And the sketch even itself seems to be looking ahead. There are a few fall trees changing colors in the image there. And I have another challenge. Can someone tell me what kind of trees those are? All right, I'm kidding about that. I don't really care about what kind of trees those are. All right. Now on to the less jokey portion of the webcast and the more formal introductions. I am Nielsen Hobbs, as I mentioned on the previous slide, and I'm the person on the left. I'm the executive editor of the Pink Sheet. To my right on screen, and thanks to the magic of the internet, actually far away, is Nancy Myers. She's the president of Catalyst Healthcare Consulting. We're going to chat about where the FDA has been recently and where it might be going, and we invite your questions as we go along. That Ask the Question button is right there, so please click on it below the media player, and if anything occurs to you. So we want it to be a sort of a wide-ranging chat, and just go ahead and ask away. So by way of introduction for Nancy, she's a Washington-based attorney with deep experience in healthcare law and regulation, policy development, and government relations. She's been closely involved in research of many kinds, drug, biotechnology, medtech over the past 2 decades, and right now her clients include innovators, investors, patient advocacy organizations, and trade associations. She's an expert in user fees, and she developed that expertise through a wide-ranging career in the federal government, industry associations, and the healthcare equity investment world. She was previously a strategic advisor in the FDA Office of Commissioner, and then within the private sector, she's worked with pharma. She's been a vice presidential level analyst with Lehman Brothers. That's not her fault. And she worked at Bio back when it was the Biotechnology Industry Organization, and she's been a senior lobbyist for Blue Cross Blue Shield Association of New Jersey, and she spent a stint on Capitol Hill itself. So we're thrilled that she can offer her unique 360-degree stakeholder view of what's going on with FDA right now, and thank you, Nancy, for being with us. What's going on with FDA right now is that we need a permanent commissioner. Just to refresh everyone on the timetable, Norman Sharpless, who has been serving, had been serving as the head of NCI, the National Cancer Institute, took over as acting FDA commissioner on April 8th, following Scott Gottlieb's resignation. And by law, Sharpless can't serve as acting commissioner for more than 210 days without someone being nominated for Senate confirmation. So that period will end on November 4th, and the current sense is that Sharpless will not be the person nominated to be the permanent commissioner. So we'll need a new leader at FDA. We'll talk about the leading contender for that post in a bit and talk about everything else on FDA's plate. But first, I wanted just to review what Scott Gottlieb meant to the agency and what's been happening under Norman Sharpless and how any future changes could affect industry. So here we go.
Thanks, Nielsen. Listen, thank you so much for asking me to help you host this webinar. I think it's such a timely issue, especially since we're all sitting with bated breath. We have heard that Dr. Stephen Hahn will be announced as a potential FDA commissioner, or will be nominated. But we're still waiting for that, and I guess what we hear is that there's background research going on, doing background checks. But, so each morning as people who watch FDA hop out of bed, that's the first thing I check to say, hey, has anybody said anything yet? And just I have to go back to the Harvey Wiley thing. If you are an FDA alumni and don't know that picture is Harvey Wiley, I am shocked and disappointed, since the Alumni Association gives out a Harvey Wiley Award every year. And so shame on you if you didn't know what Harvey Wiley looked like. But anyway, so let me hop to your questions. Nielsen, you had asked earlier what changes that Dr. Gottlieb brought to the FDA when he became commissioner. And I guess when I think about it, the biggest thing that most commissioners have done variations on what Gottlieb did, but he seemed to really hit at the perfect time with the perfect set of skills. So one of the things that he brought to the agency, I thought, was speed, agility, and existing knowledge of FDA. Though, when I worked at FDA, I worked for Dr. Mark McClellan, who was the commissioner, and the guy spoke so fast, he thought so fast, he was so ahead of everybody else in the office that I didn't think anybody could bring more energy and intensity to the job. But I think Scott really showed that, that he could, and he could do it in skinny jeans and crazy socks. But one of the things that, when Scott had the advantage of doing his first tour of duty at the FDA years before he became commissioner. The funny thing is, there were always some folks who teasingly called him the Doogie Howser MD of CEDAR when he was first there, because he was so young and so smart. But by the third tour of duty, when he finally reached the rank of commissioner, I think everybody looked at him and thought of him as the Energizer Bunny. It was very hard to keep up with him, and, quite frankly, I think a lot of the healthcare reporters, had a sigh of relief when he left, because they had FDA news fatigue. So I think, speed, agility, and existing knowledge of FDA was key. The other thing that he brought to the agency that other commissioners knew, but he seemed to put his own spin on, was his communication. He knew communications was the heart of the commissioner's role. He knew that if he wasn't on offense, touting all the great things FDA was doing across its vast authorities, that he was going to be on defense. So he leveraged new communication tools like Twitter. He communicated early and often with those interested in FDA in a way that he could communicate with internal FDAers and also people externally that FDA commissioners have always tried to use the press to reach, and he could reach them directly. He created a persona on Twitter that people felt was very accessible. Even if it was Thanksgiving, he would send out a tweet, remember you can call the USDA, the meat and poultry hotline if you needed help with cooking your turkeys. And then even during the government shutdown, when few leaders could communicate with their staff, that was something that he could tweet in order to communicate with folks. So that was one of his, and he also used to host those things called tweetorials to help people understand pathways, or to give them access to journal articles that he wanted people to have access to. So he, one of the funniest things, I was at a conference and I ran into some of the folks that were former FDAers that were, not Twitter focused. And they all had to they had to get Twitter handles in order to get on Twitter, because it was something brand new and they knew they needed to have it to follow Scott. So he was able to even change some of the old guard approaches to monitoring FDA. Then another thing that he brought to the agency was that he used his speaking engagements very strategically. He always, if you kind of look at his, and I followed a lot of these, he would go out and he'd say, hey, this is what FDA is doing, and he would emphasize the FDA's priority and make people understand why it was so important. And then he always had a little news hook during it that he would kind of leak out a little bit more information about the next thing to come, which made all of his speeches very coverable by the press, which would help FDA stay in the news and people to understand what FDA was doing. Another thing he brought to the FDA is he truly understood the appropriations process and the importance of communicating with all the members of Congress, or, especially a lot of the senators. He knew that giving them package information on what the agency's plan was, especially if he could create a win-win with what the senators and House appropriators wanted to do, and he could line it up with what FDA wanted to do, that was a win-win to get resources, which for FDA is critical. And then lastly, I think he really brought, or all commissioners have known how to do strategic plans. But he and his team really embraced these written action plans and policy frameworks that I think really helped with FDA's long-term planning. And so if you look at the action plans, covered a huge array of cutting-edge topics, whether it was an opioid action plan, an FDA drug competition action plan, a development and use of risk minimization action plan, a medical device safety action plan. There were all these biosimilars action plans. There were so many coming down the pike that you could really see where FDA wanted to be for the next 18, 24, 36 months. And I think that was a very useful tool as a commissioner. So,
great.
Yeah,
it's a terrific overview. If anyone sort of has questions on that, please sort of ask a question through the tool on the website there. So what's your sense of what's next? Sort of kind of what after Gottlieb, sort of kind of what further reforms is industry looking for? Sort of kind of and how much really sort of can a commissioner do? You talk about the action plans, or is that something that's sort of kind of that will shift dramatically with a new commissioner, or sort of what can industry expect?
Well, on that one, I think that when you're changing from a permanent commissioner to an acting commissioner, having a very clear plan of attack or approach and what you want to accomplish is very helpful. A confirmed commissioner has the support of the administration, and a confirmed commissioner also has the support of the Senate and has gone through a process where they've talked to a number of senators, they've heard about what their issues are, and they're trying to address them. And I think a confirmed commissioner comes from a position of strength because there's a built-in understanding of where the agency should be headed and what good will look like. And with an acting commissioner, I think that's much more difficult because you may have the administration support, but you haven't gone through with the Senate and really gotten into the nitty-gritty with the senators to really understand what their expectations are. So I think, as you're looking forward on, what stays from the Gottlieb administration and what drifts away, I think those action plans are a key part of what's happening. Also, things like the CDER reorganization process, that has been blessed by both the administration and now the Congress has agreed to it. So that's something that will continue no matter whether you have it should continue whether you have an acting or a confirmed commissioner. Now, with all of this, the plans are all in place for a while, but then the change of all this could possibly be depending if you get a new commissioner in place. And that's why I think everybody's looking at, who will be the next Trump, can Trump get someone confirmed within a short period of time to become the commissioner? And so that person, they come with their own mission and vision. And so looking at that that's one of the environmental things we have to continue to watch.
Great.
And you asked me another part of the question, but I forgot it.
Oh, sure. Just for kind of dovetailing on the Cedar reorg, is there anything else that's sort of kind of kind of below the commissioner level sort of structural reform that you think might be kind of changing what's going on at FDA, regardless of who the commissioner is?
Well, I think one of the big things that FDA is trying to do right now, and Scott was very good at blessing this approach, and it's really been driven by both Amy Abernathy coming to the agency and Janet Woodcock looking ahead at what the regulatory institution should look like in the future. But I think the modernizing technology, the plan that they've put in place, the action plan, is really important. I think it really shows that the agency is seeing data and the way that they handle data and the need for new regulatory tools. They're really looking forward to the next set of products that are out there. They're looking at how do you use AI to speed up clinical trials, or how could AI be help to find safety signals? And they're trying to wrap around, so in order to get the agency to the next level of being able to evaluate some of these new technologies coming down the pike, you really have to put a foundational floor in place. And so they're starting to invest in new systems and new processes, and they're trying to. If there's one document that I would read on what will actually define where FDA is in 5 years, I'd really look at that technology action plan.
Yeah, that's certainly not what people think about when they think about advancing cures or even the top line sort of user fee issues in terms of review times and stuff like that. But it seems like it will sort of make a major impact in terms of sort of how the agency both functions internally and sort of approaches new technology. So that's a very important one to watch. Thank you, Nancy. We certainly want this to be as interactive as possible. So people, please send us your questions or even just comments and observations about what you think the biggest things the FDA is doing or that you want the FDA to do. So let us know, and we'll all bounce ideas off each other. So moving on to the question of. Sorry. Yes, go ahead, Nancy.
Yes. The other big thing that I think FDA is focusing on is what steps can they take to make sure that clinical trials are being streamlined and the patient volunteers who are putting in so much of their livelihood into things that they have a good experience in all of this. And so I think the concept of streamlining clinical trials and using new tools in order to assess clinical trials and facilitate clinical trials is important. And that's where there's a real effort at FDA on how do you use real-world evidence and when can you use it, what needs to be done to be able to use it, so that you can improve the types of trials, that you can use different new data on it, and that right now FDA is very comfortable in using real-world evidence in the safety profile. That is, but they have a bunch of different pilot projects going on, and public-private partnerships, direct work with industry, things that FDA is working on to see, okay, you've got these new tools, how do we actually incorporate them into the review? And so I think that's another big piece of this.
Great. That's something that we've been following carefully. We had an earlier webinar on that a couple of months ago, and so if people want want to look that webinar up or sort of find some pink sheet stories on that, please reach out to me. And yeah, Nancy, I think you're absolutely right. That sort of industry's quite excited about this real world evidence possibilities. FDA certainly seems to think it has great promise as well. There seems to be sort of more skepticism on the agency side than perhaps there is on the industry side, and it's always interesting that sort of Amy Abernathy came from Flatiron, sort of kind of known for the compilation of the real world data, and sort of kind of she's been at FDA. Sort of most of what I hear from her is honestly skepticism. It's sort of kind of, this is not at the moment sort of a panacea. Sort of it doesn't sort of kind of substitute for sort of doing the research. It just sort of kind of helps make sense of sort of what's going on and can sort of kind of smooth out a lot of the issues and gaps that sort of kind of actually come up in those projects. So it'll be interesting to see how it all plays out. But that I think sure has the potential to be quite transformative. But it's not a kind of snap your fingers and sort of kind of make all the hassles of clinical development go away kind of thing at the moment. That's a great observation. I want to ask about drug pricing. Was certainly a signature issue for Dr. Gottlieb, put at the center of the agency's priorities. That photo we had of him a few slides ago was actually from his first speech at FDA after getting confirmed, and that's where he sort of kind of rolled out pricing as a priority for the agency. So it was sort of kind of with him from the start, and it's obviously sort of kind of manifested itself in effort to get more generics and biosimilars approved, but also getting brand name competition in various classes of treatment getting going faster. I'd argue that's kind of been a mixed success in terms of what the agency can do and has done on drug pricing. Obviously, record-breaking number of generic approvals. That hasn't really translated into a record number of launches. The industry says, well, it's not just getting the products through FDA. That's the issue. It's sort of making sure there's a viable market on the other end. And certainly the biosimilar marketplace has been famously frustrating for Gottlieb. We can talk about that in a bit, but he sort of kind of devoted some of his speeches, as you thoughtfully observed. He's sort of kind of always sort of kind of making news and sort of in the right places, and so that was obviously one of his important rollouts was his biosimilar observations. And so what about drug pricing, Nancy? Sort of kind of, how much of that is sort of kind of a consideration for FDA staff and their decision making, and for agency leadership in their policy making now?
So I have to say, I really don't think price is part of the review staff's decision making. I think they really are focused on proving, to really understanding the safety and effectiveness of a medicine. And those parameters, they don't get into pricing. I think where FDA has been sensitized, following Gottlieb's tenure as commissioner, is that they've been sensitized to what the agency can do to facilitate competitiveness and competition. And so that's where, when you have, just recently, Commissioner Sharpless, Acting Commissioner Sharpless, was talking about how the success of the number of generic approvals. I think that is something that people in the past knew, that there was a big slowdown in the office of generic drugs. And during the Gottlieb tenure, a lot of those, the kind of the things that were holding things up seemed to break down. They put a lot of staff on it. They really got things going. So I think you can, in this whole pricing thing, FDA's role is the competitiveness and what they can do. I think that was a very good step for the agency, but I don't think they're going to jump into the side of really focusing on the price. So, I think the agency, they're not responsible for the launches. They're responsible for the approvals. So they can lead the horse to water, but they can't make it drink. So I think they've kind of found a comfortable position where they believe they're, many people at the top believe they're helping the public health by making sure, one of the things that they did is they started publishing a list of products that said, okay, here are products that are expensive products that don't have any, that are off, don't have any exclusivity, that are available for generics type of thing. And, I don't know how much that list helped or not, But I think it was a step of, making a point that, hey, there's some potential for competition here. Those interested, come get it. So I think they've kind of found a good balance for where FDA can be.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly not, part of the legislative mandate to think about, pricing reimbursement, any of those sort of kind of post-market sale issues at all. Personally, I think it might be a little hard to put the genie back in the bottle. Given how prominent drug pricing is an issue politically right now, it's probably going to continue to sort of be part of the agency mantra as long as that's it's a big public debate. As you were saying, I think that FDA can't do a heck of a lot. Once they actually approve something, Gottlieb had the good fortune to sort of kind of work as the generic user fee program was sort of kind of kicking into to full gear, and obviously he had a big part in making sure that those user fees happened in the first place. That wasn't sort of under his watch, and that sort of kind of got legislated. But sort of, I remember seeing him during one of his earlier stints going before the Generic Industry Association, really sort of kind of having some pretty tart comments about their resistance to paying fees to ensure smooth reviews. It's very sort of kind of classic Gottlieb kind of speaking truth to ballroom. That's sort of kind of, he's not afraid of going before an audience and saying relatively unfriendly things. So I think that sort of kind of helped move the needle. And obviously, sure, when he was there, he helped start pushing those approvals through. So it'll be interesting to see sort of kind of how that all keeps playing out. The coverage and market issues are really what's governs price, and those levers are beyond FDA's reach. I've heard a couple of agency folks mention this, and sort of they're supposed to be publishing a study soon looking at second to market brand drugs and what factors are in their development. It'd be interesting to see sort of kind of what those findings are, since having multiple products in a class can make a big price difference, though not always. Cancer and rheumatology seem to be more swayed by subtle differences in data. Hepatitis C and cholesterol have more of a competitive dynamic on price. I'm not sure sort of how much impact FDA can have on the reimbursement or any of those usage dynamics. It's sort of kind of those sort of trends remain intact, but perhaps I'm being pessimistic. Audience, please tell us what you think. That ask the question button's begging to be pushed, and I'll wait to see if the consensus is that FDA should get out of the pricing game, or that they can actually sort of lean in harder. So let us know. I do actually see a question here. People are starting to think about user fee agreements. We were just mentioning those earlier, and are there any environmental issues that should be considered as FDA and industry move into them? Nancy, what do you think? What's going on there?
Well, actually, I think that's a great question, because the user fees are they're negotiated every couple years, and it's basically the negotiations are supposed to start kicking off in Q1 of 2020, and then there's a process that takes about 2.5 years. At least that's what we've seen in the past. And the agreement needs to be reached by October 2022. So right now, you've got industry, patient groups, FDA, all starting to look at what are the issues that need to be addressed over the next 5 to 7 years that would benefit from additional resources if FDA did additional activities outside of its usual purview. And so what's happening, so those negotiations have usually taken place in a very collaborative sense, that industry knows what it needs, FDA knows what it needs. They try to find the win-win, and the resources come in, and FDA accomplishes what it wants to. There's also now a stakeholder view on that. But the next go-around, I think, environmentally, you may see a shift in the way people view the industry-FDA relationship. So as a consultant, that does regulatory policy and strategy, oftentimes I work with my clients, and I'm kind of that, what would you call it? I guess I sit out there and look for environmental issues that are on the horizon. I'm kind of that weather, that weather ball out in the sea. But as I look at it, I see that because of the polarization happening in politics right now, that you have groups that are starting to not trust industries. They're not starting to trust industry. And all you have to do is look at this Boeing situation where, because someone IM'd that the simulator functioned in a certain way, people assumed that Boeing knew that there was a problem with their planes. I think there's just not trust there. And in the pharmaceutical industry, you've also seen some areas where people are starting to look at the reputations of companies. I mean, look at all the lawsuits happening on opioids. Look at, were drug companies lining their pockets and not worried about patients who are becoming addicted to the medicine. You've got issues of, a drug company that bought another one. There was some falsified data that they knew about that maybe they didn't tell FDA soon enough about it. You've got big companies coming out and saying, hey, there were no carcinogens in our product, and the generic actually had carcinogens in it. You have things with asbestos going on in medicines. So I think that if you get to a point where the environment is that people don't trust industry, they also may not trust industry and FDA collaborating as closely. So just as I'm thinking about what are the changes in the next user fee negotiations, that's one of the things I'm starting to think about.
That's fascinating. I mean, user fees, have been making up more and more of a share of FDA revenue, and they're obviously sort of certain conditions that have to be met. There's a certain amount of appropriated money that needs to be included. But from our analysis of the budget over the past couple of years, it's just sort of kind of more and more dependency on user fees. And the agency has always said that sort of this, it doesn't sort of kind of mean that we do what industry wants. It just simply means that it's a different or more direct funding stream for us. But you're right that sort of kind of there are these sort of kind of atmospheric trends, and now I sort of have this image of you sort of kind of on some with sort of an arrow sort of spinning wildly sort of to catch the wind like those horses do on the tops of barns. So we'll have to get some Photoshop work on that. Yeah. But yeah, I think you are sort of kind of picking up on some potentially distressing trends here. I mean, if you think about politically, the big political fights over the past few years have mostly been about price. Obviously, opioids, as you've mentioned, have been a big part of the picture. But that's sort of kind of not this day-to-day sort of safety problem that sort of kind of that we had sort of seen in the wake of Vioxx. That sort of kind of idea that sort of kind of can FDA be fundamentally trusted to review drugs and make sure they're sort of safely on the market? But as these sort of kind of problems start to sort of kind of accumulate, you think about the recent manufacturing quality issues and the carcinogens that you mentioned. I mean, it could sort of kind of get to be this point that's sort of kind of that when FDA and the agency have to go back up to the hill to get their user fee program renewed. It could be a real opportunity for a lot of venting, by the public sort of through Congress, and who knows or kind of what will sort of be asked of all the stakeholders at that point. So it's certainly worth watching. Thank you for flagging that. That's a key. It's a key issue.
I guess one of the things that I see is that, the advantage of being in this town for long enough is you start to see this pendulum of trust go back and forth. And I think you're right. Vioxx was probably a low point for the FDA. My view is that the agency really has leaned in. They're really looking at the future of regulation, and they're trying to get out ahead of it. And I think that, when you have an undermining of the potential trust of their partners, whether it's true or not, if it's just common thinking and it's not true, that will have some impact. So I think, as we're looking at new commissioners and what have old commissioners done well, I think it's trying to make sure that whatever the agency is doing is creating a communication strategy that creates trust around the agency. And that I think most people internally, at least in the leadership, are very careful about positioning the agency so doesn't look like an industry lackey, but at the same time, they're trying to use new tools to try to advance the regulatory certainty that they're after. So I always look at all these things as a pendulum, and right now I think the pendulum might be starting to swing towards the more conservative side of the world.
Yeah, that's certainly something to be concerned about, especially sort of kind of as FDA is trying to do all these sort of kind of new and sort of relatively bold things on regulatory advancement, like you're saying. Here's another question that kind of sort of I'll say dovetails with that, but it's just sort of interesting in its own right. It's is there any tools or processes in place that FDA uses to harmonize review processes across all divisions within CDER? You were talking about the reorganization, and obviously sort of kind of making sure that reviews are smooth and consistent is key for industry and for the agency. So what is CDER doing there to kind of make sure that everything is equal and harmonized?
Well, I think there are a number. I think this probably started way before Gottlieb, but there is an understanding within FDA that different divisions and different offices all may not have the same, even though they try to have the same standards and they're running off the same SOPs, that they might view things differently based on the disease states that they see. And so I think, there have been little groups created, that there are oversight groups and initiatives that FDA has put in place to try to improve the communication that is across centers and also even within centers. And I think this, the new drugs reorganization, that's part of what this is. What they're trying to do on the reorganization of in CDER is that they're creating a platform that takes out that is kind of a common platform for when you file, that they can kind of move those, they can move the reviews through very consistently, and then that allows some of the senior staff to face more outwardly and communicate what's happening. And I think through that communication, both telling the outside world what they're thinking and hearing what the outside world thinks, that also will help smooth things over so that there's a consistent work. Even FDA is trying to do some things internationally to try to make reviews even more consistent. Internationally, they've and I think you and I talked about this the other day, but there are initiatives with Australia and Canada to come together to try to look at common platforms for approvals. So FDA is taking those steps. They have heard that people want a consistent review because that keeps down costs and makes things more competitive and efficient. It's just what little steps can you take to kind of pull this all together? And I think the agency has started that.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for that. That relates to another question we got. What are the prospects for FDA harmonizing its reviews with other regulatory agencies worldwide? You mentioned the cancer review coordination that's going on, but sort of in addition to that, sort of kind of what else could happen in terms of sort of kind of having a more unified regulatory system around the world?
the great thing about the cancer review process, it seems to be where, because it is such a dire disease, and that is where regulatory agencies have really been able to lean in and try new things. I mean, just look at the Center for the Oncology Center of Excellence. I think that if this cancer review coordinating effort works, I think you'll see it in different areas. You might, usually where you see oncology goes first as a pilot, then rare diseases follows on its heels. So that might be the next area where you can start coordinating with other regulatory agencies where they're going to see a few, very low numbers of patients being affected and treatments. That might be the next area where FDA is very comfortable leaning in. But I haven't seen anything specific on that yet.
Yeah, no, I think as is often the case, it feels like the cancer center leads the way. They're now sort of part of this center. In fact, sort of cross agency organization that sort of looks at drugs and devices together through the Oncology Center of Excellence. So they've pioneered a lot of the regulatory mechanisms that now sort of seem relatively standard, surrogate markers and the like. Once they get that sort of up and running, you can see it sort of moving out to sort of other functions. Here's another question just came in. Will there be any evolution in the way in which agencies use advisory committees? I'll handle this one. I think there are a lot fewer advisory committees these days than there have been. Part of that is simply it's a cost for FDA to do it. Sort of kind of they just have to convene, have to bring everybody in, the staff and just sort of the facility costs involved. Another big issue for them is just the review timeline pressure has sort of kind of led to the decrease in the use of advisory committees. If they have to sort of turn something around in 8 months or 10 months, depending on the mechanism that they're using, there's just not as much time to see a review of a product every time. It doesn't mean that they're not using advisory committees when they feel they are necessary. Certainly biosimilars had advisory committees for sort of every review for the first several of them, and then sort of as they agency got to approving more and more biosimilars of the same product, they stopped having advisory committees if they'd already had that, and then it seems like that is now more the exception than the rule. So it kind of depends on a case-by-case situation in terms of what happens with advisory committees. I think you'll still see the agency using them perhaps in two ways. If it's if they need to send a message to a sponsor, the only one of the public ways they can to kind of let both the sponsor and the community as a whole, sort of patient advocates and so forth, sort of know sort of what the agency is thinking is through this advisory committee process. They obviously sort of communicate very directly and extensively with sponsors, but that is confidential correspondence, so they have to rely on the sponsor to release it. Whereas if they sort of express their disappointment or concerns with a particular trial design or analysis, they can do that more publicly through an advisory committee. So that sort of presents them an opportunity to defend what could be sort of a negative outcome through the advisory committee process. And then also, if something sort of is important enough from a public health advance, I think they sort of will also often try and schedule an advisory committee to just sort of let the physician community, the patient community, kind of know that this is coming. It'll be interesting to see sort of what happens with the first NASH product from Intercept, which just filed their NDA a few, I guess maybe just a month or two ago. And will that have advisory committee. From all outside accounts, it looks like the company sort of followed the endpoints very carefully. So there shouldn't necessarily sort of be a review reason to have it, but obviously it's going to be would be the first product in a big class, so that could be the opportunity for FDA to use the advisory committee to showcase for kind of what their standards are for products, and sort of kind of that this is a new class of products that will be coming out. The other issue,
I think
yes,
that
I'm sorry. Go ahead. Yeah.
I think those are very good points, and I want to go back to your timing point.
Sure.
Because I don't know this for a fact, and I have to probably do a little more research on it. But I'm wondering that if it's timing, that because they're moving so quickly on reviews, that they may not need to have those advisory committees. But I think one of the changes that's happening is this early interactions with the sponsors that may allow FDA to raise some of the issues that would have been addressed in advisory committees earlier on. So if you are able to have a pre-IND meeting and you bring forward something and you're able to really work things, communicate with the agency so that the agency can point out what its concerns are, and you can do the science in order to address the agency's concerns, those interactions may also make the need for advisory committees less. So that's just one thing we hadn't mentioned yet that I wanted to pop in there.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, there have been so many changes, over the years in terms of kind of how FDA works on reviews and sort of how advisory committees happen. It's difficult to sort of pinpoint just for kind of one shift or one change that sort of made a difference. It's probably sort of a dozen sort of kind of minor things up front that sort of kind of maybe obviate the need for an advisory committee. But I do think this sort of public vetting element is an important one for the agency. I think it's also very tricky for the agency sometimes to convene an advisory committee at all because of the conflict of interest rules. I've heard FDA officials sort of speak recently about this. That sort of kind of that there's been this sort of kind of back and forth in terms of sort of kind of how outside and independent are these advisors? They're certainly sort of not FDA reviewers, but what have they been working on with industry? Sort of on these products, can they sort of kind of offer unbiased advice? And it's especially a concern in the rare disease orphan drug arena, because there are so few experts in this area, and sort of often are kind of the ones working on the particular product. So that's what I think is going on with advisory committees. But just to say, we'll probably see less of them for both for mostly sort of good reasons, and perhaps some sort of kind of a few not so good reasons. But thank you for that question. Please keep the questions coming. I'm going to actually jump ahead a little bit. I have some nerdy charts that I hope we can get back to in a moment, but I'm going to get towards the end, Nancy, and ask you more about what's going on with what is the FDA, what is the administration looking for in an FDA commissioner? We had Scott Gottlieb, sort of the consummate insider, Norman Sharpless, who didn't have a lot of FDA experience, and now probably Stephen Hahn, who arguably has even less government experience. And so, sort of what is it about the background of Stephen Hahn that you think may appeal to the administration, and sort of what will he bring to the agency?
That is a hard question to answer, what the administration is actually looking for. But I think some of the lessons learned that the administration realized they're going to need someone who is a very good manager of FDA. And one of the things that both Sharpless and Dr. Stephen Hahn, if he is nominated, I think they've both been engaged in very large oncology medical centers, and they have been able to, they have some administrative experience of large organizations. At least that's one of the things that I think is particularly a particular interest with Dr. Hahn. I think they both have been engaged in oncology, which is one of those disease groups that leans forward. And when even as we've answered some of these other questions, oncology tends to be the leader on what are the ways that we can improve regulatory reviews. And so that may be one of the things that they've been looking at is, you're in a cutting edge area you have a cutting edge area of expertise. I think that both of them have had some experience with NIH. Obviously, Sharpless has had the more recent one. He kind of followed in the path of the Andy von Eschenbach model, where he's NCI director to acting FDA commissioner. So I don't think it's perfectly clear what they're looking for, but I'm sure that when you look at what's happened with many of the federal agencies over the last couple of years, one standout organization has been FDA, because it has been really seen as a very consumer and patient-focused organization that's been focused on the science, that's done very well, and really has not been criticized for very much the last couple of years. So I think hopefully what they're looking for in a candidate will be someone who truly will listen to what the center directors are interested in pushing forward. Someone who has a vision of where the agency should be in a very rapidly changing environment of, medical technology being combined with traditional drugs, or, when you look at gene therapies on the horizon, and the tsunami of products that are going to be, the FDA is going to be reviewing. Hopefully they're looking at someone who has his or her eye to the future, that can really lead this organization and make sure that those potential naysayers for the agency really continue to trust that it is a scientific organization that is well run, appropriately resourced, with with a look to the future.
So that's a great point. And audience, please share your best guesses and observations as to what the administration will do here. I think Nancy, like you were saying, it's there's it will be sort of in many ways sort of a shift for the agencies are going to have this kind of outside leadership without much experience. We sort of really sort of valued what Scott Gottlieb has brought to FDA. I'm not sure that Gottlieb had a Gottlieb. I'm not sure there is sort of kind of a Doogie Howser version of him that was sort of kind of working around there. So the FDA, the future of the FDA may be sort of more evolving to sort of kind of see what it can learn from outside large organizations and sort of kind of the practice of medicine as it's been going on in large centers outside the agency in the future. So that's very interesting. We are drawing to the close, so people please get those questions in. I will talk a little bit about honestly sort of kind of how unusual it's been for the agency to have a long-term acting head who was not from the from the agency. Obviously, sort of kind of since there've been Senate confirmed commissioners, there have been sort of kind of this acting posture in between the confirmations. But generally, sort of those acting commissioners that sort of kind of come from within. Generally a very straightforward elevation of the deputy or a deputy to the top job. That most recently happened with Stephen Ostroff, who took over from Robert Califf at the end of the Obama administration. He reprised that role that he did sort of when Peggy Hamburg handed off to Califf just a year and a half before that. Obviously, as you mentioned, Nancy, sort of Andrew von Eschenbach did not play that role. He came in from NCI to be an acting an acting commissioner of FDA, and so when we at least when I sort of saw that sort of happen with Norman Sharpless, I thought, oh yes, we've seen this drill before. This is how it goes, and it's actually really sort of deeply weird, even though there's been I guess I'll go back to my chart here and say it's been 9 some years of acting commissioners and 13 years of confirmed commissioners. So sort of not too disparate in terms of the experience. It sort of is sort of unusual to have FDA led by an acting commissioner from the outside for this long. So that's very very interesting. Here's another question that we got. What impact will the recent executive order limiting agencies from issuing guidance have on FDA?
Well,
Nancy, I don't know if you want to take that one.
Sure. So FDA thrives on putting out guidance and trying to, part of what industry has requested of FDA is additional guidance to clear the path, to really understand the pathways or understand FDA's thinking on certain issues. So it's not, if you start looking at the language of these orders and things like that, FDA, you have a cost estimate that happens, it's triggered at a certain threshold. And FDA has been playing within that, and many other agencies have too. So I don't think this is one that's, right now, it hasn't seemed like it's been a priority to question this. I think there's an OPM document that, or I don't, is either, no, OMB, sorry, getting my acronyms mixed up. But I think they're supposed, yeah, right. So I believe there's supposed to be an additional document that OMB has put together. But for this, I think that most people understand that FDA does guidances, that much of the guidance is non-binding, but it's helpful, and I would expect that FDA continues to do that.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think for the most part, FDA is an exemplar of good regulatory practice. They're widely disseminated. They're easily available on their website. There's a long comment period, and there's a heavy emphasis that it's non-binding. So I don't think sort of FDA is really sort of the target here. I think what might be interesting to see is if this whole issue of guidance, and especially recent guidance, can't sort of kind of dictate enforcement practice, or whether that sort of plays out into some sort of emerging areas for FDA. Like, let's say, well, they want to go after CBD products, or questionable stem cell clinics, or sort of kind of other kind of areas that they haven't sort of kind of enforced that much on. It's sort of kind of will there be a precedent through this executive order that you're going to allow companies to kind of to skirt sort of a more recently declared standard from the agency. So definitely want to watch. And we are drawing towards the end of the hour, so please get your questions in if you want, and I will now take this opportunity just to kind of zip through those slides, because I can't resist a captive audience to watch my historical data. Sorry, my alarm is going off, so apologies, folks.
But Nielsen, just to kind of wrap this up, I think it's very important for folks that are watching FDA to realize that having a fully confirmed commissioner benefits the agency. A number of commissioners have come out and said they did an article, I think in January of this year, where 7 commissioners said that it would be helpful for FDA to be outside of HHS in order to disconnect it from any political, from the kind of this back and forth on acting to commissioners. So I think when you look at what's coming forward for the agency, I think that the agency is leaning in. It's really positive, but I think they have to make sure that they've got a strong person at the head to protect the agency and to make sure it's communicating all the great things that the agency does and the thoughtful way that it does it.
I think that's a great point, Nancy, and thanks for driving that home. I certainly, recently saw Scott Gottlieb after he's left the agency, even then, saying how important it was to have FDA confirmation that as you mentioned earlier, he's got Senate backing and he's got administration backing, and so when he gets in, interagency fights or even has to make a tough regulatory call, decision, judgment call, he knows he's going to has stronger rock underneath him to stand on when he has to do something difficult. And so, I personally don't see this this FDA being pulled out of HHS and stood on its own anytime soon. Honestly, just good because of the natural tendencies of all people to think that once they have something under their purview, they're loath to give it up, and just that human nature, regardless of who the HHS secretary or president or Senate chairs of the committees might be. That's just the way of the world. But we can always hope, Nancy, that there'll be more independent thinking and runway for FDA to just follow the science and implement best practices. But just wanted to say thank you to everyone. We did not get through my slides. Nancy and I were joking earlier that maybe we should have just scrapped those slides, and she was right. We didn't actually end up needing them. But if anyone wants to follow up with me, I would love to spend 5-10 minutes running down historical commissioner data. So please take me up on that offer. And I just wanted to remind everyone that they will be getting a copy of the audio of this presentation, and they will be getting the slide deck, so you can do your own historical analysis if you want to. So appreciate everyone's time, and Nancy, especially your time, and thank you for joining us on this webinar.
My pleasure. Thank you.